Chapter 2. Can anyone tell me what a Calvinist is? With eager determination, I arrived back at campus that evening of October 15, 1970. I had decided, as I made the drive through the darkness, that I would begin my quest even before I went to bed that night. I realized that the dormitory of the Baptist college was full of Baptist preacher boys. Surely there was one who knew what a Calvinist was. I would go to those who were closest to me and ask them the same question the scowling committee member had asked me. "Are you a Calvinist?" It was quite logical that my search should begin with my roommate, Todd Shelton. Todd was a character, to say the least. He was a few years older than I was, and he had been, to hear him tell it, and he did like to tell it, quite a rounder before his conversion. He was a sought-after preacher, perhaps mostly because of his pre-conversion stories, which so impressed everyone, especially the young people. Todd also had an eye for the young ladies. That worried me sometimes. I'll never forget the night he asked me to borrow my car for a date. Knowing his practice and reputation, I lent it to him on the condition that he stayed out of Lakeview Park, the local lover's lane. I guess I really shouldn't have been surprised when, about 10:30 that night, several guys from the dorm came pounding on my door. They were laughing and shouting that they had caught me in Lakeview Park, and when they stopped to approach my car, I had roared away. I learned from that experience that Todd's word wasn't very good, and I also gave him a good dressing down when he returned to my car for breaking his word and damaging my reputation. But he only gave me his boyish country grin, and he wouldn't even admit he had been in the park. After I took off my coat and put it in the closet, I decided to ask him my question as he was lying on the lower bunk reading a comic book, which was his usual means of passing the time of day. Reading comic books even took preference over his homework and the Bible. So I told him I wanted to ask him a question. Without even looking up, he said, "Sure, go ahead." Then he said, "But it sounds serious to me, and I can't promise I can answer it." Perhaps he was expecting me to come down on him again for something. I knew no other way to get it out, and I really wanted to get to the point, so I asked him bluntly, "Todd, are you a Calvinist?" "Not me," he replied quickly and confidently. Thinking perhaps that he was bluffing, like I had before the committee, I next queried, "What is a Calvinist?" I realized at that moment that I probably would get a snow job answer, which was Todd's usual style, to act like he knew everything about everything, even though he didn't. Understanding how that characteristic of Todd so irritated me at times, I felt even more ashamed for playing the same game with the committee when they had asked me the question about Calvinism. Without thinking for a moment, and hardly looking up from his comic book, Todd replied that a Calvinist was a Presbyterian, because the name came from John Calvin, the founder of the Presbyterian denomination. When I asked what Calvin believed that might be so offensive to Baptists, Todd assured me it was that Calvin believed in infant baptism, just like the Roman Catholics. "Is that all?" I asked, somehow feeling there must be more. I'm not too sure old Todd was dealing with me from the top of the deck. "That's it," he replied. I must admit, I did feel better about my interview before the committee, if Todd was right, because I had answered their questions on baptism from the Baptist perspective. But if infant baptism was the crux of Calvinism, why had the question even come up? I had spelled out in great depth and with care the Baptist view of baptism prior to the question of Calvinism. Because of this, I had a sneaking suspicion there was more to this subject than just baptism, especially in the light of what I knew about Todd also. I decided to move down the hall of the dorm to see if anyone else had more to offer on the subject. As I stepped out into the hall to begin my pursuit to other young theologians, I immediately bumped into Marvin Simpson. "Have you got a minute, Marvin?" I asked politely. "Sure, Ira. What do you need?" he replied. Marvin was a nice guy, and he was a spiritual boy, probably considered by many to be the most spiritual Christian on campus. He had a prayer life that was unmatched. It was a standing fact that he prayed hours upon end, and that one might stumble on Marvin in some very unusual places on the campus at some very unusual hours on his knees in prayer. There was even a joke that circulated that one day a faculty member couldn't get into the restroom stall on the ground floor of the men's dorm for 2 hours. Each time he went in, the lights were off and the stall was locked. Finally, a further check revealed Marvin was in there praying with the stall door locked and the lights off. I never had the nerve to ask Marvin about the truth or falsity of that story. "Marvin, are you a Calvinist?" I asked quietly, not wishing the whole floor of students to hear my question. "Ira," replied Marvin with his usual warm and fuzzy spiritual voice, "that sounds just like a doctrinal question to me, and I really don't know too much about that doctrinal stuff. All I want to do is to love and serve Jesus, and to help others to do the same." I tried again. "Have you ever even heard the word Calvinist before?" "Well, yes, I suppose," he said reluctantly, "but I can't recall exactly where or when. I really think you would be better off seeking the Lord rather than these theological subjects. But if you insist on your pursuit, why don't you try Ron Masters?" he suggested. "His dad is a pastor. He probably would know what a Calvinist is." After thanking Marvin for his help, I made my way down to the far end of the hall to Ron Masters' room. True, Ron's dad was a preacher, but I never had possessed much confidence in Ron's call to the ministry. He was a super guy, but seemed to be a square peg in a round hole as a ministerial student. His real interest was the anatomy of the human body and medicine. He had books upon books on his shelves in his dorm room, which dealt with such subjects. We all were convinced that he could name every bone in the human body. It was a standing joke that he knew more about the human body and medicine than the school doctor did, who many considered to be a quack and just a pill pusher. I had often wondered if Ron had ever become a preacher to please his father. I found him, as usual, reading from one of his medical journals. He was alone in the room, for which I was glad, because I didn't want to converse with two persons at one time on my delicate subject. I popped him the question with some brief introductions, as I said, "Ron, your dad's a preacher, and you've had a lot of experience in the local church. Would you call yourself a Calvinist?" He replied with some caution, saying, "Well, I never really made a study on the subject, but what I've gathered from my father, we would not be Calvinists." I must admit that I found it humorous that when Ron spoke of theology, he always spoke in the plural, giving his father's view and his as one. "Why not?" I asked. "Well, from what I remember," he replied, obviously probing his own powers of recollection, "Calvinists don't believe in evangelism, missions, or even a public invitation for men to come to Christ." "Why not?" I asked again. "Well," he said hesitatingly, "it was something to do with their view of predestination and election, but I'm not sure exactly what. Why don't you ask Charlie Hester? He should know." Charles Hester was the campus brain. He was a senior and was always at the head of the dean's list, and had never made anything less than an A in any of his subjects while he was in college. No doubt he would go on some day to teach. He had the smarts. But one always felt intimidated when caught in a discussion with him, let alone when knocking on his door and instigating one. But by now I was desperate. I had been told that Calvinism was Presbyterian, and it referred especially to the baptism of infants. I had been told I would be better off to go pray and seek the spiritual rather than ask questions about doctrine. I had been told that Calvinists didn't believe in missions, evangelism, or even public invitations because of their view on predestination and election. I felt like I had just interviewed 3 blind men who tried to describe an elephant from just their single perspective of research. Somehow, I wasn't convinced I had gotten to the heart of the matter yet, as far as definition of Calvinism was concerned. Hesitantly, I knocked softly on Charlie Hester's door, not wishing to disturb him if he was asleep. The door opened to a dimly lit room. The only light was a lamp on Charlie's desk. It was obvious that he was studying. What else did Charlie ever do besides study? As the books and papers were piled high in various places. He invited me in with a look and a tone of voice that said, "Don't stay too long." I apologized for the late intrusion, but I assured him that I had a question which no one in the dorm had been able to answer and that he was my last resort. He didn't even invite me to sit down, a clear hint he wanted me gone as soon as possible. So with a deep breath and a conviction that question couldn't wait till morning, I asked him, "Charlie, are you a Calvinist?" His reply was direct and quick and emphatic, and he acted almost insulted at the question. "Certainly not," he said with a scowl. As he spoke, I had no concern that he might be giving me a smoke job like Todd had. When Charlie spoke, people received it as a gospel. Not knowing how far I could push it without being asked to leave so he could get back to his studies, I quickly blurted out, "Why not? Why are you not a Calvinist?" And he was quick to reply, "Because Calvinism, with its strict view of predestination and election, whereby God has supposedly chosen only to save a few elect persons, and also has decreed the remainder of the non-elect to an eternal hell, robs man of his personal decision for Christ and his freedom of choice. Such a position is also immediately torpedoes the Church's work of evangelism and missions." His statement blew my mind. How could anyone ever believe that? No wonder the men on the church committee asked his question with such a scowl. I was glad I'd given the answer I did. I thought it was time for me to leave Charlie's room, or else. Yet, how surprised I was when instead of dismissing me, Charlie offered me more information on the subject. He said that there was an acrostic often used to summarize the Calvinist position. It used the word tulip. The T stood for total depravity. The U stood for unconditional election. The L stood for limited atonement. The I stood for irresistible grace. The P stood for perseverance of the saints. I quickly wrote the acrostic on a piece of scrap paper as follows: T, total depravity. U, unconditional election. L, limited atonement. I, irresistible grace. P, perseverance of the saints. Charlie told me he didn't have time to explain these areas of doctrine to me more fully, but offered to do so at some future point in time. It was the friendliest Charlie had ever been to me. Perhaps he was happy to see one of the underclassmen take an interest in theological pursuits, or at least to be concerned with more than girls and comic books. I returned to my room, sensing I had made some progress, but not much. Not wanting to forget my research of the night, I made a few notes concerning Calvinism. I had been told the following. 1. All Calvinists are Presbyterian. 2. All Calvinists believe in infant baptism. 3. All Calvinists believe in the predestination and election of a few to eternal life. 4. All Calvinists believe in the predestination of all others to eternal death. 5. All Calvinists deny man the freedom of choice. 6. All Calvinists rob man of a personal decision for Christ. 7. All Calvinists deny the Church its work of evangelism and missions. 8. All Calvinists do not believe in public invitation. 9. All Calvinists believe in total depravity, whatever that is. 10. All Calvinists believe in unconditional election, again, whatever that means. 11. All Calvinists believe in limited atonement, again, whatever that means. 12. All Calvinists believe in irresistible grace, same thing. 13. All Calvinists believe in the perseverance of the saints, same thing. As I got ready for bed, I noticed that it was close to midnight, and my body was bone-tired, as it had been a long day. My mind kept turning over these concepts about Calvinism. I wasn't satisfied that I had really found the answer to my question. In fact, I didn't even understand what I had been told that evening concerning Calvinism. What is total depravity? What is unconditional election? Were all the above statements true? As I crawled into bed and turned the light off, my mind began to formulate further plans to research my subject. I would interview certain faculty members of my Baptist college. Surely these men of education and knowledge could tell me what a Calvinist is. My mind began to formulate questions to ask when I interviewed them. Is it true that all Calvinists are Presbyterians? Is it true that all Calvinists believe in infant baptism? Is it true